I'd like to say a big welcome to you all for our second webinar in the series, From Access to Discovery. Today we're going to be talking about sharing digital health and AI-driven data for innovative research. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are standing, and in the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. For me, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and we extend respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people who are joining us today. Wherever you are, we acknowledge and pay our respects to our First Nations people. So today's seminar is a really nice mix of topics. The purpose is to address the current practical, technical, managerial and ownership challenges of digital data sharing. As you can imagine, it's a big problem, but we have some great experts with us today to walk us through some of the solutions. So today we're planning on learning from each other, asking questions and discussing topics of interest. The seminar is being audio and video recorded. We will send you a summary of key points and a link to the recording at the completion of the webinar. And you can add any of your questions and answers to the chat, to the Q&A chat. So please do feel free to use it. And if anybody's using social media, please use our hashtag #MPEvent2024 hashtag. Thank you. So it's my great pleasure to show you the lineup of our presenters. Today we've got Professor Nick Zepps from Monash University, Dr. Avanish Kondaboyana from Outcome Health, and Dr. Kristen Kang from the Australian Research Data Commons. And we're going to start with a presentation from Nick. So Professor Nick Zepps is the Operation Director of Cancer Research Program. I'll just put it back on that slide for a moment, and a professor within the Department of Chronic Disease and Ageing at Monash University in the School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine. He was recently the Director of Research at Northern Health, and he's had leadership roles in national and international research programs, including the NHMRC Research Committee and the Health Ethics Committee. In 2017, he was commissioned to co-write the current Australian Clinical Trials Handbook for the TGA and was awarded the NHMRC Ethics Prize in recognition of his contribution to human research ethics in Australia. So Nick, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us. I'll stop sharing my slides and Nick can join us.
Great. Now, I think my video is being disabled by the host, so you might...
Oh, no.
There we go. That's all right. I've got the permissions up, so here I am. Right, so I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you. I'm not going to, as always, read through the PowerPoint because that's the death by PowerPoint, but I think there's a few things that I just want to sort of visually represent so that it's perhaps some guidance to the audience. I've had a long history of working in biobanking, using clinical data and trying to understand and get to grips with what we actually mean by ownership, custodianship and various things like that. And yesterday I was actually at Northern Health for their research week. So there's a plug for Northern Health. They're having their research week at the moment. And Paul Monagle, who's was a former director of hematology and clinical services at the Murdoch Children's, took us back through some of the things that he went through when back in Alderhay and the Bristol Royal Infirmary 25 years ago or more, where there was the revelation that people had been keeping babies' hearts in jars, so to speak, literally in formalin-filled jars, which had been the practice at the time. But it erupted into what could be described as a scandal, which led to a large change to the way that research was done in the UK and disrupted research for a couple of years. And Paul had been responsible for overseeing similar processes to sort of make sure there was compliance in Victoria, which followed in the sort of 2001, 2002 and so forth. And it really was a huge disruption. And I think people have forgotten the extent to which not getting it right or using practices that were acceptable at one point, which have no longer become appropriate, can have a profound change on what we're trying to do. So the reason I'm going to raise that and why I'm going to talk about it is that in many senses, there was an emphasis many years ago, and there still is, about using biospecimens, but equally now we're very interested in personal information. And that can be in a whole range of different formats. We're going to focus obviously on health today and about the information that we collect, but we do know that when we're trying to investigate the broader health elements, and particularly population health and things like social determinants of health, we're going to need to know other pieces of information about a person, and that can include their information about their income, their cultural profile, and a whole range of other things which are very personal to a person. And the Office of the Australian Government, what they used to call the Privacy Commissioner, now the Australian Information Commissioner, has clear definitions of what information is. And so you can take a look at this list and you can see that it relates to if you visit a health service, but also what notes are taken about on you from your health provider, but also any wishes that you have, potentially any genetic information about you, and that's something kind of interesting. But we also know that in health, it's actually quite hard to transfer this data between different health services. So it's not freely available. But at the same time, it does provide us, and particularly now as people start talking about machine learning practices, neural networks, with the latest Nobel Prize for physics. Weird that it's given for physics, but about neural networks. But that is really where we're at in being able to utilize the data to try and create insights which will improve the lives of people. But it is a double-edged sword because there are risks to it as well. Now, I just happen to go to the websites like Vahi and say, well, what does Vahi say about data governance and data custodianship? Because why not go to a source that is reputable and reliable? And of course, they talk about an owner as defined as the person or entity that has legal possession of the information asset. There's also stewards who have accountability or delegated authorities, and then custodians, which have delegated responsibilities for certain outcomes by the steward as outlined in the agreed written schedule. So this is rather complicated because it's using terminology that, we often think we have very clear understandings of what ownership is. We might own the clothes that we wear. We might own or have expectations about property that we own. But it can become quite abstract when we start talking about other things where we might feel that we have an interest, but not necessarily direct ownership. And so tissue is an interesting area like that because it's not regarded as property, but people have interests and there are a bundle of rights ascribed to it. And data is becoming more and more complicated in that way also. So for those of you who love case law, I'm not a lawyer, but I have an unnatural interest in law. Julie Hamblin has provided what I think is a very nice summary of a piece of case law around data ownership and medical records in one of the few readings where we actually can look at case law to inform what happens about ownership. So in this, the Judge Bryson of the New South Wales Supreme Court handed down a judgment on Breen versus Williams, and in effect dealt the plaintiff a blow, saying that she didn't in fact have any rights to her own medical records, and that the doctor who had created the record was the owner because of the art of creation and writing it and recording it. And so I will share this with you and the links, but obviously it's very important to read some of these kinds of things and think about the fact that he still ruled that it was okay to have access to it, but the ownership lay with the doctor. And so her question was, do I actually need a subpoena for this, or should the doctor make it available without subpoena? And the judge ruled that in fact she needed to have a subpoena. He used some interesting case law to back up his view. High Court in Rogers versus Whitaker, which those of you who are interested in ethics will understand is the sort of genesis of a lot of the informed consent to medical treatment legislation, which says, what is the right to tell someone about the relative risks they're going to have if they have a medical procedure, and about what is the basic standard of disclosure. So I think the interesting points, and this lawyer who comments on this has made some personal sort of perspectives on it, saying that it was probably a little bit misguided in saying this, a steadfast refusal to recognise changing approaches. And again, I alluded to a case in the UK of keeping babies' hearts in jars, which was not illegal. But once, it can be ethical, it can be legal, but does it meet the tabloid test? Does it meet the test of changing social acceptability? And the short answer was no, it didn't. And so again, I think an argument in which we say, well, the hospitals and everyone own the data, and therefore that gives them rights over the information that's being disclosed to the people it's written about, is actually conflicting a little bit with other kinds of legislation like the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations, which stipulate that people should know what is being collected about them and they should have a right to correct it. This is one of those reasons why, doctors should not write gratuitous comments on their medical records, because they're, for fear that through FOI, they might be forced to disclose these. And of course, within Australia, we have a federated system. So I've just picked on New South Wales because that's what popped up when I did my search. But they have an access to health information for healthcare consumers disclosure, who actually says very clearly that the health record is owned by them. But you have rights to access it, viewing the record at the health service, having it explained to you, having a copy or electronic format. So again, this is sort of throwing up the idea about who ultimately is owning or having responsibilities or having rights to the information. And there's a paper here, which I'll make again available to you, which was published. The UK do quite a bit of work in this area. And it was just talking about, particularly as we move into artificial intelligence, and we might be saying, well, we just want to look at radiological images and we're applying AI and it's de-identified. There'd be no expectation that anyone would have any rights to this. And indeed, there's lots of instances when it's stated that fully non-identifiable information is not personal information and therefore is not subject to the legislation, the privacy legislation. But again, that might not sit well if someone was to find out that their data had been used in this purpose. And a lot of people are very happy to give their consent, very happy for things to happen. But there is a typical thing of people saying, and I remember this at the time we were doing the biobanking, because I was heavily involved in then constructing the ethical and the sort of part advising on the legislation around the use of human tissue in Australia. In fact, I chaired the committee that wrote the national statement chapter on this. But the issue we had there was that patients would say, well, I would have said yes if you'd asked me, but now since you didn't ask me, I'm going to say no. So there's this sort of, you should have asked me. And also patients relayed to us that they wanted and to be granted an act of altruism in being able to say yes and to give their data and their specimens as a gift, and that they were being robbed of that right of altruism and some sense of ownership if you didn't ask for their consent. And I think there's a whole bunch in this paper for those who are interested about alienable and inalienable rights, and there's additional papers relating to the law, which I think are interesting for those of you who particularly like these kinds of things. And I do suggest that you do go and read it. But it's something we can't ignore, and it's something that we need to be aware of, because whilst we might say, oh, well, we're all acting for the greater good by sharing information with one another, that may not be a view that will be permanently shared by the population. This is some of the US information. This is from the HHS, just talking about, again, intellectual property rights to control intangible objects that are products of human intellect. So again, we'll often say, it was an interesting thing, Supreme Court and High Court rulings in various countries, and in the UK, College of Surgeons ruled that the curator of the museums who gave cadaveric material to an artist who then later buried it in his garden. It wasn't theft because there was no property in the samples that had been given, but the judge ruled that the act of preservation using formalin and the art of those who had dissected the specimens created intellectual property. So again, that seems to be where the legislation is falling, is that if you do something to the data, then you create an ownership relationship to it. But obviously, data ownership has importance. People often think about trading it. I know that a lot of people will be very upset if you said, oh, well, you're selling their personal data. And we only have to think to some of the scandals with Facebook and others, the Analytica scandal. There's a huge nomenclature. I haven't got the time to go into this, but again, I'll make all of this available. Just about different terms that people use: creator, consumer, compiler, funder, decoder. I mean, it's dizzying. And then there's also this problem with data hoarding, that people tend to host data and then hold on to it and think, oh, well, I'm just going to wait. It's like a fine wine. As it gets older, it will become more and more valuable, which, we know that there's only a certain point at which that will actually work. So again, there's legitimate reasons why one might restrict access, but at the same time, we want to make sure that it's available to everyone. This really boils down to is, do you have a good governance framework to be able to create the sharing? And there are examples of good data governance frameworks. I've borrowed heavily from this, from the AIHW, to inform my own governance frameworks, and I commend the document. I think it's rather well written. And again, you should get copies of it. But if you don't do it, you do possibly run the risk of being at the end of one of these. And I think we should be scared. If we have identifiable data, it is not so much that we own it and we hold it and we've got all the rights to it. We've also then got the responsibility of what happens if it gets hacked. What happens if it's passed on to someone inappropriately? Well, there are millions of dollars of fines now. And certainly in the UK and Europe, there are huge fines, up to 4% of turnover, 20 million euro fines being slapped on institutions and organizations that fail to live up to the expectations of protecting privacy and undergoing data breaches. So this is not something to be ignored. So again, coming back to the Australian government, we've got data custodianship. This is about how do we do data integration. Again, there's a lot of information there that I suggest you go to the web pages and have a look. But the purpose I put this up in, and I'll finish on this, I believe in reading the manual. You think that's a sort of slightly stupid thing to say these days, is, just read the manual. But really, it's your best protection. Create a manual, abide by the manual, make sure others have read the manual. The key rights and responsibilities are written. We know what they are. We know that we have to follow the legislation. No one should hide behind the, well, I didn't know. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, because that is no defense. That is no defense whatsoever. So we're going to talk about wanting to share data, but I'm going to implore those of you that collect data, have data custodian rights, have certain responsibilities as the data custodians, to make sure that you're aware of all your responsibilities and then to abide by those. And to not create situations in which you make it very hard for yourself to comply. So again, don't do things that are really difficult to do. Always ask yourself, do I really need identifiable data? Why am I using identifiable data? Could I possibly do this another way? Why am I not getting consent? Should I have a dynamic consent system where I can also ask people regularly about their ongoing desire to be part of this? And that's certainly the way it's been operating in other countries. The UK's huge endeavours around biobank, their use of open safely synthetic data solutions are some of the examples of this. So we're going to be talking about a little bit of this at the forthcoming Health Translation Queensland are doing it, but we're all friends and partners of all the Artex, and they're going to be having a conference in the end of the month of November. We're going to be having a whole system, and we're going to have presentations from the Open Safely guys from the UK. I'm going to suggest that you attend that, and that you, at the end of the day, read the manual. That's my punchline to the talk today, and hopefully that will stimulate some discussion.
Thanks so much, Nick. That's absolutely fantastic and a really great start to the seminar. We're going to leave questions for the end. I will ask one quick question though, because I think this one will be relatively quick. So somebody's asked, where does synthetic data fall in terms of who owns the data, and does it matter?
No, so that please come to the Open Safely presentation. That synthetic data is really, if you like, it's owned by the person who generates the synthetic data because it's a creation. It's something that they've done. They've done work to it, but it's created from real data. So often it'll be the instance that the person who creates the synthetic data also has a relationship to the primary source of the data. So again, there's a sort of bit of a chain of custody of those data, but the synthetic data itself is owned quite explicitly by the people who generated it.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Nick. Okay, hold fire. We'll come back to you because we've got a lot of questions at the end, I'm sure. Thank you so much. Now I would like to welcome Dr. Avanish Kondiboyana from Outcome Health. And Avanish is going to speak to us about to use or not to use AI in healthcare research. It depends on who's asking. And just a quick introduction about Avanish. He's a postdoctoral researcher at Outcome Health and the Murdoch Children's Health Research Institute. His areas of expertise include building machine learning models using healthcare data to allow the early prediction of poor health outcomes in preterm infants. And in his role at Outcome Health, he leads the analysis and interrogation of the primary care dataset extracted in partnership with the primary health networks from over 1,200 general practices across Australia. So a big job, I can imagine, Avanish. And his work revolves around the translation of research findings into actionable insights for practitioners with a strong focus on improving community outcomes. So Avanish, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Carol. I'll just share my screen. Yes, can you see that?
We can, thank you.
Great, yes. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Monash Partners for having me. On behalf of Outcome Health, I'll be providing a brief overview of the role artificial intelligence, or AI, is playing in healthcare research. So, before we get stuck into a discussion into AI, I want to clarify a few semantics. AI is a broad catch-all term that is used to describe machines that can perform acts that would normally require human intelligence, such as learning, comprehension, problem solving. Within this broad category, there are multiple branches that you might be familiar with. The first one is machine learning. Traditional machine learning requires a fair bit of human input because it requires a structured data set, which means that both the features and the outcomes are known. It will then find patterns between the features and the outcome. Machine learning algorithms can perform really well even on small data sets. Now, despite its fancy name, even a simple linear regression is a form of machine learning, where we're looking for the relationship between a known outcome, the salary, and a known predictor, the years of experience. Now, a subfield of machine learning is deep learning. This can work with unstructured data, meaning both the features and the outcomes are not known. Deep learning uses neural networks to determine which features are important and uses them to cluster the data points into groups. This method needs large data sets to get accurate results. For example, we can train a deep learning model to categorize pictures of pizzas, burgers, and tacos based only on the similarities or differences it automatically detects in the images without any further human input. Finally, there is natural language processing, or NLP, that uses both machine learning and deep learning to train large language models like ChatGPT. These models are extremely data hungry, and it took about 570 gigabytes of text data, which amounts to roughly 300 billion words, to train ChatGPT. Further in the presentation, I will talk about how each one of these subfields can be used in the healthcare space. Today, I'll be touching upon two main topics. I will first talk about a practical case study of using health data to train a machine learning model, followed by a discussion on how AI can help facilitate data access for healthcare research. Let's first talk about the case study. So a bit of background first. When a patient goes to a doctor with a mental health issue, and the doctor wishes to prescribe an antidepressant, they have a challenging task ahead of them. They have to sift through 23 different antidepressants and consider each one's indications, contraindications, and side effects in relation to the patient's medical history. After performing these mental gymnastics, they need to arrive on one option for the patient. To make the job of the doctors easier, we wanted to develop a machine learning model that would learn the past antidepressant prescribing patterns of doctors and present them with top 3 choices. The doctor would then pick the best one based on their clinical judgment. To do this, we asked a wonderful master's student, Tao Duong from Monash University, to help us develop this machine learning model. As part of her work, she collated the current prescribing patterns of antidepressants using data from Outcome Health. She created a dataset that included patient characteristics as predictors, such as age, antidepressant history, current medications, current diagnoses, to name a few. She also gathered the antidepressant prescribed for that patient as the outcome of interest. She then trained a machine learning model on this dataset to determine the connections between the prescribed antidepressant and the patient characteristics. We can then feed a patient profile into the model, and it will give out the top 3 options for antidepressants for that patient. Now, all of this sounds lovely. But first, we had to test the accuracy of the output of the model. The main method of checking the accuracy of any machine learning model is to check its output against the dataset it was trained on. Using this traditional route, we found that our model had 80% accuracy, which sounds pretty good. However, we also wanted to test the accuracy against the therapeutic guidelines. Therapeutic guidelines is a leading source of independent, evidence-based, practical treatment advice for clinicians working at the point of care. Our accuracy when using the therapeutic guidelines was a mere 50%. This indicated that only 50% of doctors were prescribing antidepressants according to the therapeutic guidelines. Why was this? If we go back to the original picture, where we assume that a doctor is taking all 23 antidepressants into consideration, we found that doctors were only prescribing a narrow range of antidepressants, probably the ones they were most familiar with. Furthermore, they may not be referring to the therapeutic guidelines every time they prescribe an antidepressant to a patient, which can indeed be exhausting in practice. What this means for a machine learning model is that the outcomes in our dataset, which is the prescribed antidepressant, was not necessarily the ground truth according to sound medical knowledge. Thus, this was a classic fallacy of AI: garbage in, garbage out. Thus, instead of a machine learning model, Tao built a program that incorporated all of the complex rules for prescribing antidepressants in the therapeutic guidelines. This program takes as input the patient profile from the medical record at the clinic and gives the top 3 options for antidepressants, considering the indications, contraindications, and side effects for each antidepressant for the patient. This program can then be deployed at the point of care in clinics, and doctors can access this resource during patient consultation itself, which can ensure the patient is getting the most suitable antidepressant. This case study highlights one of the many challenges of implementing AI models in healthcare. First, it is imperative to ensure that the outcomes in your dataset are based on ground truth through clinical expertise. This often requires clinicians to go through every piece of data and label it. This can be a time-consuming process, compounded by the fact that clinicians are very time-poor people because they're busy doing more important things like saving lives. Second, sample sizes tend to be small, especially for niche projects, because they require specialized datasets. This can also lead to a lack of generalizability because the sample size may not cover all demographics. Third, there are often some data quality issues, such as outdated data, because of constantly changing clinical practices. Lastly, there are practical concerns with the implementation of AI models. There's an inherent lack of interpretability in AI models owing to their black box nature, which can lead to a lack of trust by clinicians. They could also cause disruption to the clinical workflow, which can be a barrier to their adoption. I should point out that even though in our case study, we found that simple logic was superior to AI models, and despite all these challenges, AI models have shown some success. AI models have found their place in diagnostics. An AI system developed by researchers at Stanford University can diagnose pneumonia from chest X-rays with greater accuracy than radiologists. AI has helped in drug discovery as well. Benevolent AI used its AI platform to identify an existing drug, baricitinib, as a potential treatment for COVID-19, which was later shown to be effective through clinical trials. AI can also help with something as complex as mental health. MindStrong Health used AI to analyze patterns in smartphone usage, such as typing speed, voice tone, text sentiment, to detect early signs of mental health disorders, such as depression and anxiety. Here's hoping for more such exciting stories. Next, I'll touch upon how AI can be used to facilitate data access in research settings. First, let's talk about the challenges that researchers face when trying to access healthcare data. Patient privacy is paramount. To protect patient privacy, there's a lot of red tape that researchers must deal with, such as ethics and governance. This leads to significant delays in accessing data, which is compounded by the fact that researchers have limited time within which they need to use the grant money. It could take up to a year in some cases from the time of submitting an ethics application to finally getting their hands on the data. This ultimately delays advances in much needed research. So even if researchers do get access to the data, they're faced with even more challenges. Healthcare data tends to be very siloed, and there tends to be limited standardization of terms. Thus, when accessing multiple sources of data, there's a lack of interoperability between the sources, necessitating the need for significant resources in just cleaning the data to make it usable. One way to get around the privacy concerns when sharing healthcare data is by deep learning models. So, the primary concern when sharing healthcare data is that even if identifiable information like name and date of birth is hidden, the unique combination of variables in the data can point back to the patient. For example, there might only be one 100-year-old who has been diagnosed with skin cancer in the last 1 year. Thus, to provide an additional layer of privacy protection, researchers have worked on creating synthetic data. Without going into a lot of detail about this, the way synthetic data works is that a deep learning model takes the original dataset as input, learns the statistical relationships between the various variables, and then this model can then generate a synthetic dataset that maintains the overall relationships between the variables, but modifies the individual data points through random noise. This way, the unique combination of variables pointing to a single patient is randomized, preserving privacy. This can help reduce the amount of red tape researchers face and facilitate easier data access. A synthetic dataset termed synthetic mass was created that contains 1 million fictional but realistic residents of Massachusetts in the US and mimics the doctor's visits, vaccinations, and social determinants of the real population. This dataset has been used in developing and testing various health IT applications. An example of the lack of interoperability and standardization is unstructured clinical notes. A doctor could write something like, diagnose the patient with diabetes mellitus I. This kind of unstructured data is less desirable for research purposes. This is where natural language processing comes into play. These models can take in these unstructured data, clinical notes and discern that this note is talking about a diagnosis, and so it will place the data in the diagnosis column. Furthermore, it can determine that it's a diagnosis of diabetes type 1 and determine the corresponding SNOMED code. This structured data is now much more usable and can be used by more researchers. IBM's Watson Health utilized natural language processing to analyze vast amounts of unstructured medical data, and by doing so, the system could identify patterns and predict patient outcomes. On average, Watson found 1.2 more important problems missed by physicians per patient. Now, should we use AI in healthcare or not? Different people might give you different answers. A researcher might want to create advances in healthcare through AI, but will face many stumbling blocks when accessing the data. A patient might be supportive of their data being used to help future patients, but worried about their privacy when their medical data is being shared. Regulatory bodies will be supportive of the efficiencies that AI models could bring to the clinical workflow, but concerned with the misuse of medical data and ensuring the fairness of AI models. The major stumbling block to further development in AI is the question of who owns the data, like Nick talked about in the last presentation. Is the data owned by the patient, the doctor treating them, or the hospital where the data is stored? I used to think that the patient always owned their own data, but according to what I heard in this previous presentation, maybe not so much. However, if we wish to create advances, we need to move away from a data ownership to a data custodianship conversation. We at Outcome Health collect data from general practices across Australia, and instead of keeping it locked away to age like fine wine, researchers can apply to access the data. We have a custodianship model to ensure approvals and governance are in place and data is used ethically and for translational research. We hope our model can be replicated more widely to ensure both the ethical and widespread use of health data. Thank you.
Fantastic. Amazing. Thank you so much, Avinash. That was like a masterclass in how to navigate data through the healthcare system and for uses of research and others. We'll leave the questions till the end, so I will come back to you at the very end of the presentation, if that's okay. And
Okay.
we will welcome our third speaker, who is Dr. Kristen Kang. Kristen is going to speak to us about the HASANDA initiative, a national initiative for research data sharing, which is something that Monash Partners is very passionate about. So Kristen, we're very happy to welcome you. Kristen is the Australian Research Data Commons, or ARDC, Manager of People Research Data Commons, a $20 million development program to support national data infrastructure for health research. Since 2020, Kristen has led the Health Australia National Data Asset, HASANDA, program, which was established across 72 Australian clinical trial organisations that designed national standards for data sharing and developed the Health Data Australia platform. So, Kristen, thank you very much for joining us. We're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Carol. And apologies to Carol and Robab when they were trying to finalize details of the session today. I was actually on extended leave. So given what the previous speakers were focusing on, I'm broadening the scope of my talk just a little bit. So I'm going to be talking about HASANDA, as Carol mentioned, but I'm going to be talking more broadly about ARDC's national digital infrastructure initiatives in health. I'd quickly acknowledge I'm joining you all from Canberra, so I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of the land here. But ARDC is actually a national organisation with people all around the country on all kinds of traditional lands, the Kaurna, the Whadjuk Noongar, and so on. So I pay my respects to them all. To begin with a little bit of an overview, I would assume that most of you don't know who ARDC is, so I need to explain that. It will feel like maybe a little bit of a gear change for you in the context of this talk. ARDC is part of this family of organisations that are on screen at the moment. We are funded effectively and exist because of a Australian Government Department of Education initiative called NCRIS. This is a program that's been in place for over 20 years in different forms, and basically is there to establish the kinds of research infrastructure that needs to run at a national scale that's beyond the scope of what one university or institution or a small group of them could provide. So some of you will know the PHRN, the National Imaging Facility, we sit in that family. This is actually our old strategy slide, but it's kind of got useful information for you. ARDC, what we do, we're not a health research organisation, and what our focus is on developing what we call research data infrastructure, digital infrastructure. So that covers off on a really broad range of things. So it is technology and systems. It is software. It might be building up data assets themselves, so data collections that have national significance and value. It's also the policy work that goes around data and enables data to be used efficiently in research, and also skilled workforce. So it's quite a broad approach that we take. And we work across every university in Australia, government, different peak bodies and national organisations, as well as part of international community in research, data and infrastructure. We work with researchers, we work with their organisations. So that's a quick snapshot of who ARDC is and kind of where we sit in the national research landscape. The People Research Data Commons is the name that we've given to what's effectively a 5-year portfolio of work to develop digital infrastructure for health research. So this all began via a quite large public consultation, review of various government and peak body roadmaps, strategies, policy positions to identify what are the kind of key challenges in the data space for health research. So what came out of that is on screen. Researchers need to know what data is actually out there. There's not a lot of visibility of what data is being held by different organizations, by different studies, by different government groups, services, etc. To work on data, moving on to the second challenge, there needs to be secure technology to allow secure access and use of the data. Thirdly, we want to be able to bring data together from different sources to integrate it together so that we can work on larger data sets, provide more statistical power and other advantages to research. And of course, AI, machine learning is really on everyone's minds at the moment. So that came out in consultation as well. How can researchers take advantage of machine learning to work on health data? So to address all of those challenges, we've established different programs of work. Again, this is very brief run through of them. So in terms of making data discoverable and findable, and this is where I'll be talking about the HASANDA program, our clinical trials program in more detail a little bit later. But we've built Health Data Australia, which is a national data catalogue. I put this one first because it's my baby, but also it's something that's actually come out of a few years' work already with Monash partners and our other partners around Australia. You can go to it right now. It's currently a catalogue of clinical trials data. It allows people to search for data being held around Australia and to request access to it. And over the next 3.5 years, we're onboarding additional kinds of data. So beyond clinical trials, we're going to be onboarding health cohort data and government data at a minimum. The second national program of work we're doing is around this kind of data integration, pulling data together from different sources. And what we identified as the opportunity for ARDC to provide something to health researchers is by using this thing, as some of you might have heard of OMOP, Common Data Model. There's a lot of technical detail behind that, which is not the purpose of today's talk, but the really strong use case and kind of lead use case for this is that your different hospitals or health services have all their patient records, their medical records held on different systems, that the different kinds of systems, they run different kinds of information standards. The data is recorded and stored in different ways. So what OMUP does is actually provide a common set of variables, a common naming system, a common coding system. And we we'll be working with different health services and hospitals to connect them using this OMOP system to basically be able to pull in data, medical record data and other health service data into a cleaned, harmonized data set so that Australian researchers have access to that. The third broad area of work is around creating these safe spaces to work on data. So we call them trusted research environments. And it's basically where instead of having data sitting on your laptop or your work PC or whatever it might be, it sits on a remote server or some kind of remote environment where it is secure, it is locked down. You can still work on it, but it's got all those technology safeguards in place so that the data isn't able to inappropriately leave that location. Now, a number of these kinds of secure platforms already exist. Monash, for example, has the SERP platform, but there are a number. Some of you probably have worked with the Sachs Institute and the Shore platform. There really is now a proliferation of them. So what the issue that we identified is for, say, a data custodian, how can they determine if someone outside their organization can be given access to their organization's secure environment? How can they be trusted? Or if someone is requesting data from that organization and wants to use it on their own secure platform, how can that platform be trusted? So the approach that we're taking here is to develop a national framework around trust, really. And that includes aspects of governance, of risk management, of security, and of course the functional requirements. What kind of features does a secure platform need to have for a user? And the fourth area rather, is in this kind of advanced analytics AI space. The particular opportunity we identified here is to focus on what's called federated learning. So we just heard from Avinash a great explanation of machine learning and models there. And this is very hypothetical, but a common scenario there might be you've got all the data sitting in one place that you can access. You can run all your models there. What if there's issues around that? What if you want to run your model over data that's currently collected in Australia, maybe across multiple different institutions overseas? That's where this approach of federated learning comes into play. So you don't actually need to bring the data into a one central location and run your models there, train your models there. You can actually set up a system for allowing the model to be taken to where the data sits, to be trained on that data and have the results of that training fed back to you, as opposed to having the data itself move across jurisdictional boundaries and start hitting up against any of those kinds of issues. So it's a very kind of particular use case around machine learning and quite advanced, but we are starting to see, at least from an international perspective and some national perspective as well, that this is a one part of the kind of leading edge of how to use this kind of technology to address those governance and privacy issues in health data. So that's a quick, broad overview of all we're doing in the health space over the next few years. Now I want to jump into specific detail for the second half of my presentation about what we've been doing in clinical trials. This is currently the most mature piece of work. So this is the HASANDA program that Carol mentioned. This is one program within the larger health portfolio, and it's a partnership with a large number of organisations that do clinical trials in Australia, focused on clinical trials data sharing and a few million of investment to date. So quickly, why are we focused on sharing clinical trials data? So there's three broad points that I want to make here. One is that by sharing clinical trials data, you can actually improve the science that you're doing, the research that you're doing. We've just released a guide around this about the kinds of secondary research that you can do. But broadly speaking, you're talking about ensuring integrity of clinical trials, improving the impact and translation of trials using evidence synthesis, meta-analyses, and so on. But you can also improve the productivity of research by allowing new research projects, secondary research projects to be done by supporting those collaborations, and so on. The second reason that we would share clinical trials data is that when you actually speak to consumers, and we've done commissioned these kinds of consultations, a lot of consumers actually expect that their data that they contribute through trials is going to be used as widely as possible. They want those checks and measures in place to make sure that it's used appropriately. But they're actually, a number of them are surprised when they say, why aren't you using my data? You know, I gave it to you, you took my time, please do the best research that you can. So there's definitely an ethical angle here. And the third thing I want to raise was that there's actually an economic benefit to sharing data, and obviously funders are pushing for this. One of the reasons is really, and I've highlighted on screen, there's some data that can not be readily recollected, or it would actually be a burden or imposition on a patient to go back and do another trial to collect the same kinds of data. So there is more research that we can do with the data that we already have. So what I'm getting to here is that there is actually a moral imperative to share clinical trial data and to reuse clinical trial data. So what has our approach to this been? We put together this standard program. We had a number of peak bodies, national bodies involved to guide us through this, including Clinical Trials Alliance, including the ARA network, including NHMRC and Health Consumers. And we built this Health Data Australia platform. So as I said, you can go to it right now, you can search for trial participant data. You can see what data sets are held by trials around Australia. So these are some screenshots of what the platform looks like. These are the search results. You can click on a search result and you can see a description of what the data set contains. You don't see the data set itself, that's sensitive information that sits with the trial or their custodian, but you can at least find out, oh, this trial, this custodian is holding this data. That might be something that I could work with, subject to some negotiation. And that negotiation is initiated by submitting a data request through the platform. That request then goes back to the custodian or to the trial, and they review it in against their own governance policies and procedures. So again, my role in this presentation is to bring you up to speed on what current national initiatives there are in this overall space of data sharing. These are the contributors that we already have as part of Health Data Australia. These are our clinical trials partners. So there are 9 nodes listed on screen here. You can see Monash and partners here. I saw in the participants before, we've got some guests from some of our other nodes. It's great to see you all. The 9 nodes cover, as Carol said, 72 organisations. And at this stage, look, we launched the platform about 12 months ago, just over 12 months ago. We're up to about 200 plus data sets on there, and we're actively working to increase that number. Our current focus is in this space around the governance aspects, the procedures to make data sharing just a standard part of trial protocols, generating this metadata, which is the stuff that you see in the catalogue, and to make sure people that contribute to the catalogue or might look to request data are properly trained. The broader people RDC focus areas I was talking about, such as secure platforms, that's stuff that we're going to be heading to in the next 6 to 12 months. Just to finish with, and I know this is a whirlwind talk, but to bring it back to I think the start, some of the stuff that Nick was talking about, we actually, even though we are not a health research organization, we are not a governance organization, we are a digital infrastructure organization. Data governance is really a key barrier enabler type thing for data sharing, obviously. So we've put part of our resources and our efforts into trying to address this. This is a current project that we have in place. We are partnering with CTIQ. I really should put their logo on this too. And it's to start trying to develop a governance framework and resources to guide people involved in sharing data. And the kinds of people we're talking about are trialists, are researchers, are governance officers, are ethics committees. So we're developing a framework around the principles and roles and responsibilities. Our nickname is the GCP for data sharing. We're doing a bunch of consultation and assessment activities to see what the current knowledge gaps are and the training gaps are. And then starting probably in the new year, we'll be developing a resource toolkit that provides information, guidance around data sharing, governance. And one thing I just want to point out, something that we've already completed in a previous project with this group is a template PICF for data sharing. I've probably gone over time, have I? At any rate, I might leave it there so that we have time for good discussions.
Thanks so much, Kristen. That's great. I'll get Nick and Avinash to join us again. We've got some terrific questions, and I thought I'll start with some of the ones that have popped up online. For starters, I think for Avinash, how do the data source and ARDC acting as a mediator between the data source and the researchers ensure a zero trust environment? Specifically, oh no, sorry, Kristen, this is for you. Specifically the ARDC has access to the real data. How can we guarantee itself does not modify the data? Oh, even I could answer that one, Kristen, go ahead.
I'm still reading the question, so Carol, you start and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, so I think that particularly with Hasander, we act as we don't actually hold any of the data. We are actually just a custodian of, it's like having a library catalog. We have the catalog of what the data includes, but not the actual data itself. So there's no way that the Hasander nodes can manipulate any of the data because they actually have no access to it whatsoever. So what Hasander does is catalogs what is available so that people can link researchers who have the data with people who are interested in using that sort of data. But Kristen, over to you for a broader answer.
That's exactly right. Sorry, I am a slow reader. That's why I needed a moment to catch up with the question. But yeah, exactly as Carol said, the Health Data Australia catalogue is just that. It's a catalogue. Doesn't actually contain the things. That's not what a catalogue does. Catalogue just lists what data sets are out there in the world. So really, and the phrase that we use a lot is it enables data discovery. So as a researcher, I might want to do a meta-analysis on pick a vaccine or pick any kind of therapeutic intervention. I really want to know what data is out there in trials. And so this is a way of being able to find what data is out there and a hopefully more efficient mechanism rather than emailing corresponding author provides you a platform where you can submit a request saying, hey, I see that you're holding some data. The data is not on our platform. The data is with the trial. Our platform does allow you to send that request to the person who's holding the data and initiate your negotiation with them.
Thanks so much. Great. There's another question for you here too, Kristen, from Jessie Zeng. I'm interested to hear more about the feasibility of federated learning to train models based on data from across different jurisdictions due to security and confidentiality concerns, especially the complexity of different jurisdictional requirements or regulations. Is this program more likely to utilise published or de-identified input parameters for building models rather than any raw data?
Okay, so you've asked about the area that I was really hoping no one would ask about, because it is my colleague Nana Bharathi who leads that program of work. It's obviously a very deep technical area and one that I am not fully across. So I'll have to take that one on notice while other people are talking. We are now. I need to double check. That's what I'll try and do before the end of the session. We are publishing a framework and the outcomes of some initial demonstrator projects in that area that will hopefully give a bit more insight into specifically what our approach is there. But yeah, Jesse, if you did want to follow up with this offline, unfortunately, I can't provide a direct answer, but I can put you in touch with my colleagues who can.
Yeah, no problem. We can provide Kristen's email, Jesse, so you can follow up. There's a couple of other questions. Let me see. I think this one is for you, Avinash. Therapeutic guidelines are largely based on single disease cohort trials. How does the model actually know the result is best evidence? Wouldn't the evidence build gradually on the basis of AI guidance over time?
Yeah. So therapeutic guidelines are updated regularly and is based on the latest literature that exists for all the different, well, here we only talk about antidepressants. So as more information of antidepressants is being put out into the literature space, the therapeutic guidelines are updated through Australia's most respected experts. So they include stuff like, is this a first line, second line, a third line antidepressant? What are the side effects of each one? What is an indication? What's a contraindication? So then we look at the patient profile and see what medications they're currently on. Is there any contraindication for the antidepressant that they're on? So these are a very defined set of rules that the therapeutic guidelines gives us for antidepressants. And so it's a fairly simple, well, when I say simple, it's all logic based. It's not simple, but these are very defined and updated regularly by experts. So they can be considered the ground truth for our purposes.
Fantastic. Thanks, Avinash. And there's another one. I think this one's for you too, Avinash. Do you have regulations or specifications for synthetic data? For example, if the original data has 8 columns and 8 of them are considered personally identifiable, the synthetic data would only include the remaining 2 columns because the first 8 shouldn't be revealed. However, if this results in synthetic data, it's too small to effectively train a model. Are there alternatives?
Yeah. So when taking into account personally identifiable information, you can, in the metadata, you can say which ones are personally identifiable, and then it will still find connections between the personally identifiable information and the other columns. But then it will put a placeholder text instead of instead of the identifiable information. So the relationship will still be there, but it won't give you it will give you a dummy email address, for example. But the patterns will still exist. Synthetic data sets are usually done with a lot more columns, because in this case, if it's just 2 columns that you're trying to emulate, it's a very trivial task if you're trying to just extend that. But it gets really complex when you have multiple tables of data with multiple rows. That's the kind of stuff that I was doing at Outcome Health with synthetic data. We had about 50 tables and about 1 million rows each. So that is a mind-boggling number of information that we had. So yes, to answer your question, even a small data set will work, even if it's personally identifiable, it would placeholders instead and still find relationships between them. You're on mute, Carol.
Thanks, Avinash. Sorry about that, everybody. What are your opinions on recent reports of the collapse or failure of AI models developed using synthetic data? So apparently this was published in Nature in 2024.
Yes, I like that one. So that's a very good question. That relates to the large language models like ChatGPT and Copilot. So in that, what researchers did was they used these large language models to generate text and then retrained their large language models on that same text. And they did that 50 times. And then by the end of it, it just it just spat out gibberish. So that relates to large language models. The synthetic data sets that I've spoken about in my presentation, it takes health data, the real health data, and uses a deep learning model to analyze patterns in that. And then the result that you get from that, the synthetic data, is then just analyzed using another kind of model. You're not refeeding the synthetic data that you create back into the model that created it itself. It's a separate analysis. So in that aspect, I don't think synthetic data, at least for healthcare purposes, will run the risk of this collapse. It relates to large language models.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks so much, Avinash. And everybody, you might notice Kristen's put some information in the chat regarding that last question. So if anybody's interested, have a look. He's put some websites and a contact email for the ARDC as well. Nick, there's some questions for you. Why is there such confusion over data ownership versus data custodianship, and what problems has this caused?
Because people use the terms interchangeably, and I think there's a bit of a lax usage of the various terms, and people tend to just fall naturally into what are quite usual terminology. So we normally talk about ownership. We don't really talk about custody. Sometimes we talk, obviously there's areas in life that you go into, such as custody of children, and some of those can be used because it's not about an ownership of a child, it's about roles and responsibilities toward an individual. And so people use possessive language when they shouldn't. And to some extent, this answers the question that Andrew's asked, which is about one day individuals can sell their personal data. If they own it, then they can sell it, they can trade in it. I don't see that happening. I think the law will remain as it is. The case law is there, and the statutes are fairly clear that people have rights and people have interests. But generally, I mean, you can trade your own data now. You could say to someone, well, I'll charge you $1,000 for my data, and they'll say, get lost. So again, market forces will dictate that you just wouldn't bother with some of those kinds of examples. And there was some work done on human tissue about this some years ago, about commodification and whether someone with a rare tumor could, if their tumor was then used to realize a cure, and that has happened. There's been communities of people, Moores versus Regents is case law around that, for instance, in the US. But the determination there was the public interest in the research outweighed any private interest in realizing the money. And while the person had a right to know it was happening and should have given their consent, they didn't have a right to any of the proceeds or fruits of the intellectual endeavor that the people who use the data to generate cures or patentable discoveries. So I think people need to take a deep breath when they're talking about these things and sort of return to some more sort of common sense approaches. But it is vexed because people think they know and they go, oh, I own this data. And you go, yeah, okay, great. But that means you're on the hook for it then, tick your it. So if you get sued, you're the one that will be left holding it.
Yeah. So there's actually a question, you've touched on a couple of points which are in some of the questions there, Nick. So one of Andrew Carey asked, regarding the idea that one day individuals or patients may own their own personal data and may be able to sell it, which is what you were sort of referring to.
That's what I was responding to, yeah.
Yeah.
No, they won't. I doubt it. And in the same way that, we're asked for our opinions on hotels and flights and food and, if anyone shops online, you're bombarded with, could you please rate us on Trustpilot and things like that. And obviously there's a commercial imperative to that because doing so will contribute to their sales. And if you turned around and said, well, no, I'll charge you $10 for a review, then you're actually breaking the social contract, which is why I think on the flip that researchers shouldn't try to monetize some of the public data sets. And I think that there is a general feeling amongst the public that would be unacceptable. So if we collect large data sets at Monash, as we do in our registries, and then we sort of traded it to the highest bidder, we would find ourselves on the wrong side of the public perspectives about what we're doing. And people will say that. They'll tell you, I don't want it being sold to drug companies. I don't want it being sold. And that caused, when that did happen in the UK, some of you may remember there was an instance of that with general practice. It was an utter disaster.
Could I just follow up and respond to part of that? And I agree with what you're saying, Nick. I know in lots of the discussions that we have with, say, trials, saying, oh, sharing data, where do I get the resources for that? One thing I just want to add some nuance. I think, yeah, monetizing and making profit off someone's data, that's one thing that everyone should be aware of, in my personal opinion. But I think that's a separate issue because I know that, as I said, people come to us say, well, how do we get the resources for this? There is lots of precedent, and I think it's also, legally and ethically justifiable to do cost recovery because
it is.
because if you're going to share data, provide access to data, that doesn't come for free. Someone has to work on that. There has to be systems in place. So I think they're just two separate things. So I know that we've probably got a broad audience, and before everyone says, oh, there's no way that we can even just recoup our costs, then
Oh, it was actually one of my slides. So in the CSIRO data governance framework, it's actually part of the thing that it's legitimate to charge cost recovery for the basic costs associated with running the business. I mean, when we were looking at this in human tissue, we were saying, well, you can recover the cost of the collection of the specimen, the time taken for the person to transport it from theatre, preservation, all of those things. You just can't sell the tissue itself. But you can say, well, it cost us $300 to get it from theatre to you, and we can cost recover the cost of that process. So I think there's a difference, and that is recognized, and I would say in the NHMRC and various MRFF grant directives, the direct research costs says you can absolutely put that in as a budget item in your grants, that these costs are legitimate.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example. A lot of people are familiar with the cost recovery when it comes to biospecimens and material transfer, but they haven't thought about it when it comes to data. It's, yes, it might be technically a different kind of substance, but there's still that resource
It's
cost.
very similar. And we should be applying the similar principles, and they're fairly well worked out now. So I think that's good. I know certainly for a lot of data repositories, I work with a number that do in fact charge a cost recovery fee for access to the data, and that is seen as perfectly legitimate. I think there's a difference between saying, I need to drive a Bentley, therefore the cost recovery is, $10,000 a specimen versus, we're just trying to keep the lights on.
Of course. The other thing that I was going to add just into, it's a little bit of a tangent from the question that was asked about participants, profiting off their data. But I think there's a theme somewhere in that question around what control participants have over their data. Now, I just want to mention something that's a bit tangential to what we've been talking about, but if people have heard, and Nick, I'm sure you can tell people much more than I can about this, but the idea of dynamic consent. So for those not aware, the idea that you consent to share your data, but you actually have the ability to change that consent over time, or more nuanced than that, pick particular instances where your data can be shared if a new project is proposed or new use of the data is proposed. So you've got much more fine-grained control over that. So it's definitely something, I know it's something that the genomics world is probably, to my understanding, advanced as anyone.
Quite true. And our friends at CTIQ, if you go to the CTIQ website, there is an e-consent project, which I was involved in. And there are several examples. It needs updating because some of the links are a bit old, and we can ask our friends there to update it. But yeah, things like the Mackenzie's mission and the genomics platforms at the Children's in Melbourne certainly were doing that. And dynamic consent is it's actually a topic that's been around for a number of years, and now it's enabled with technology that enables people to do that. I'm in a couple of studies myself, and I encourage everyone to go to the George website and sign up for Join Us and get onto clinical trials, because if you're a researcher and you're not willing to participate in clinical trials, there's something wrong with you. There are other organizations that enable that kind of thing. But absolutely, I'm in a clinical trial with a dynamic consent right now, and it works quite well off the app.
And I would say, just to kind of balance out the discussion, while it's clearly something that clear value and benefit, the actual implementation of that, especially from a systems perspective, infrastructure perspective, very difficult. So it's something that we can aim towards and work towards. And I think the kinds of projects that you're involved in, Nick, and the groups that I know are great, the leading edge of how to do that. But to actually get kind of system change around that is difficult.
Mm.
Thanks, Kristen. Avinash, do you have anything you want to add to conversation there? No, great. Okay, no problem. Nick, there's another question from Andrew. Just is it logical to think about data ownership currently based on current regulations, just like any supply chain? For example, researcher develops clinical database or biobank. They might have reimbursed participants to collect the data, then the research or institution owns the database. Then, as is common, they charge a fee to access or recoup the investment to their product. And as an example, recently with a clinician we're working with at Mime, they said they wanted access to a large database and it would have cost them about 20K. It's all right, Andrew. It is long-winded, but I'll
That's all right. I mean, I think these are important conversations because, I think as Avinash was saying, we want to utilize these technologies to deliver the best outcomes to patients, and we want to make sure, and that's what patients want. But someone somewhere has to pay for this, and we need organizations, whether it's government, whether it's private enterprise, and private enterprise is not going to do it unless there's a return on investment somewhere in the piece. So I think we do have to have a parallel conversation about all these exciting technologies, but ultimately, how are we going to make this sustainable? How are we going to make sure that this operates effectively? And I think that is useful. Like fora like these are really important to sort of showcase the technology, but then juxtapose it against, we're doing this in a society where people are not necessarily willing to share the cost, but we're all sharing it through tax, through donations, through individual payments. If we access healthcare and we pay, what we don't want to see is people getting filthy rich off the back of some of these. And I think that's generally been the sentiment. I think a fair price for the activity, I think most people would agree with. But again, what we don't want is, and this is the plug for our work in February, that we're doing, we're trying to also reduce the bureaucracy around low-risk projects where we know the patients are very keen to have their data used, but we've created bureaucratic hurdles which cost thousands and tens of thousands of dollars to comply with, which achieve nothing towards the patient safety and do nothing but really sort of move bits of paper around. So I think there's the flip there as well, that we've got to look at all of those elements.
The work of Monash Partners. Thanks, Nick.
I was going to throw out a bit of a left field idea around that. That is, there's a discussion that's very, all hot right now in the area of earth science at the moment around this concept of data provenance. And it's really this idea in kind of earth environmental science, the data they work with, surprise, surprise, very different in origin and permutations than it is in healthcare. So you might be talking about big sensor networks, whether they're marine sensors or deep space or various sensor networks, that the raw data that comes off there will go through one organization that does some manipulation on it, maybe some cleaning, then another organization that does some more extraction, another. And so it's something that they're having to think about in that community quite a lot from the IP perspective. If I'm working with this kind of 8th generation data set, and I think a lot of it might be coming from the kind of academic angle, what about my citations? What about, what is my IP ownership in this? But they are actually a lot more in this kind of data management, data sharing space, although it's different. It's not sensitive data, health data that we work with. A lot of their thinking is maybe about 10, 15 years ahead of where health and medical is. And there's probably a lot of concepts that they're working with now that could inform what we need to be thinking about in 5 or 10 years' time.
And I think that interdisciplinary, I mean, we learn a lot from other science approaches, and I'm going to, because we're in the theme of physics, Newton said, if I have seen further, it is because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. And so others are doing great work, and we learn from this constant. And I think there is a little bit of this area as well, where we have to think, how can we make sure the data is going to the right person at the right time? I might not have the tools and capabilities to use the data in its best possible way. And the last thing we want is data hoarding and people sitting on data sets when they could be available to other people with clever techniques. And we know that we've seen people who've had solutions to town planning have had, people who've designed semiconductors, people who've, all of these other areas have enriched other fields. And I think, having that ability to look across what's happening in these other spaces is fundamental. So a sort of a wonderful podcast that you can listen to at the moment. I listen to Sabine Hofstadter, who's a physicist, and there's a lot of really interesting things out there, which I think inform what we do. So, and I think physics and various other areas are good examples that can inform us.
So I think the issue around IP and data sharing is really important. Avinash, do you have any comments about your experience with IP and data sharing?
Yeah. So in terms of IP, what we at Outcome Health do is collect a lot of data from private practices and store them. But it's not just that. We apply lots and lots of transformations to that data to make it into a very usable format. We don't use natural language processing yet. We're not that advanced. But just simple things like the date might be in the wrong formats. We standardize the dates in the correct format. The names, there's a lot of work that goes into it. And then in terms, all of that is our IP, so to say. So I've been recently involved in a lot of mapping out all of the transformations that we do and to clearly show the amount of work that we put in and what's our IP. But of course, all the raw data that we get is from the practices, which is again a little bit of a contentious issue because the practices fall under the PHNs, and so the practices from the practice point of view, they own the IP. From the PHN's point of view, they own the IP. And then from our point of view, we own the IP in terms of the transformations. So it's an interesting conversation that we end up having with the PHNs all the time regarding whose data it actually is. But we do make all of the transformed usable available to researchers, depending on, there's a lot of approvals and governance that has to happen before that can happen. But we make sure that it is being used for good, for translational research, for ones that will have the greatest impact, all of that.
I think working across the hospitals is complex, but I think working across primary health primary health networks might be even harder, Avinash. Very complex. Yeah. Okay. So I think we're just about ready to wrap up. We've covered all of the questions and all of the ones that I had sort of noted down in addition to the ones that are online. I just wondered, Kristen, Nick, and Avinash, it's been such a great conversation. Do you have anything else that you want to comment on or mention before we finish up?
I might just say it's a very exciting time to be doing this work, and I think there's a great thirst for doing it in a careful and respectful manner. And I think as long as we've got these kinds of fora to exchange ideas and to be challenged and to constantly strive towards excellence, then I think we'll be doing okay. And I think as long as we're guided by that intent, then I think the public can be rest assured to some extent, but we must always strive to meet their expectations.
Thanks, Nick. Okay, go ahead, Kristen.
My final comment was to say thanks for the opportunity to chat about this stuff and to do the thing that if I don't do, my comms team will murder me. So that's to pop our link in the chat for everything that I was just talking about. So thanks, folks.
Perfect. Thanks, Kristen. And Avinash.
Yeah, just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to present here. It was fascinating listening to all the talks. It's been something that we need to have a conversation about, and in order to, it's for the greater good, really, that we're doing all this. So yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you so much. So thanks everyone for joining us for our Sharing Digital Health and AI-driven data for innovative research. It's been a great afternoon, and I'd particularly like to thank Robab Aldukani and Victoria Kotzebos from our Monash Partners team. Robab is our data lead, and she's done a wonderful job putting it together and making sure that the speakers were on topic. And V organises it within an inch of its life. So V, thank you so much for your wonderful coordination of our events. Okay, thanks everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Bye, everyone.